please feel free to include those in the Q&A box as well. If you have any other concerns, please let me know. And do you all have any questions before I? Okay, fantastic. And without further ado, I would like to present to you the Executive Director of the Center for Racial Healing, my shero, Dr. Catherine Meek.
Thank you, Dominique, and welcome again, everybody. It's so wonderful to have you take the time to come and join us for our programs at the center. We are so honored and humbled by your presence and so grateful for your support of this work in the ways that we have gotten. Now that we've had to move to a virtual platform and doing our programs because of the COVID virus, we have had such a response from a larger community, as you are witnessing tonight, from all over the country, which would not be possible if we weren't virtual. So thank you for helping us to deal with a serious and sad situation, but to come out in so many ways in better shape than we would have been had we not had to adopt this way of being together. It is my amazing pleasure to be able to present to some of you, because many of you were here last time and many of you already are acquainted with Miss Michelle Duster, but I want to just read a little bit of her biographical information and then say another word or two before we listen to her. By the way, Dominique did not say this, but we will listen to her presentation and then there will be a chance for us to engage in questions and answers with her. And she did ask you to put those questions in the Q&A box. So we will have a wonderful and lively conversation the same way as we did last time together. Michelle Duster is an author, professor, public historian, and champion of racial and gender equity. She has written, edited, or contributed to 16 books. She co-wrote the popular children's history book, Tate and His Historic Dream, co-edited Impact, Personal Portraits of Activism's Shifts, and an anthology of women's growth through change, and Michelle Obama's impact on African-American women and girls, and edited 2 books that include the writings of her paternal great-grandmother, Ida B. Wells. She has written articles for Time, Essence, Huffington Post, Teen Vogue, and the North Star. She has appeared on MSNBC, CNN, WTW, CBS, and CW, as well as numerous radio shows. Her advocacy has led to street names, monuments, historical markers, and other public history projects that highlight women and African Americans, including Wells. Her book, Ida B., The Queen, The Extraordinary Life and Legacy of Ida B. Wells, is published and available now. And we had, Dominique, do you have your copy to show to people? If not, I'll get mine out here in a minute. It is a lovely book that I want to encourage you to, if you didn't get it already, to go quickly when you finish with this program and order it, because it is a lovely book that you will be inspired by reading and having just available to sit and go through and pay attention to the artwork and some of the graphics that are in it. The graphics are just phenomenal, as well as the layout. I am so honored to have the opportunity to be introducing and presenting Michelle Duster, but more than that, to be encouraged by her quiet, assured, profound manner in talking about her great-great-grandmother, and yet standing in her own shoes and being a very self-contained, powerful woman, just as her great-great-grandmother was. And it's such a delight to know her. Welcome again, Michelle. We're so grateful for this time you have chosen to spend with us.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that great introduction. Oh my gosh. And thanks for having me back.
It's all true.
It's exciting, especially knowing that people were here last week and they're back again. So yay, thank you so much. So, I mean, last week I talked about the life and legacy of my great-grandmother. And today I'm going to be talking about the Black women's experience in the suffrage movement, which my great-grandmother was part of, but also relating it to, so my topic is the Black suffragists and the fight for inclusion. And so it's not only about the suffrage movement, but about the continued struggle for Black women to be included in this struggle and in this history. So I will, let's see, I will share a screen. And once I get that together, then I will.
Perfect.
Wait, hold on, I need to make it so that it fills up the whole screen. Okay, so I'm going to now start my timer, so I want to make sure that I stay within the time frame. Okay, so like I said, so it's the African-American suffragists and the fight for inclusion. And this is obviously as much as I can talk about in 30 minutes. So this will be a brief overview of our experience in the suffrage movement and beyond. And so just to start, wait a minute. Wait, I think I skipped it. Give me a second. I'm sorry. I just need to check something.
No problem. Take your time.
I'm sorry about this.
Nobody's perfect but God, you know.
Okay. I confused myself. This has been a crazy day. I'm sorry. Okay. I thought something was wrong, but it's not. Everything's good. Okay. Take two. Let's see. View. Okay. So I'm going to talk about give an overview of the suffrage movement, and then talk about how the experience was different between Black women and white women. There were obviously other women involved in the suffrage movement, but I'm going to be focusing on the African-American experience in the suffrage movement. So before I get, so I want to just give an overview of how there were basically like almost two different stories for the suffrage movement. So this is the experience that white women had in the movement. So it started in the mid 1800s with mostly middle and white women as an extension of abolitionists. Now, a lot of the women who were originally involved in the suffrage movement were actually abolitionists who were trying to get rid of slavery. So they thought it was morally wrong to have people enslaved. But the thing that's interesting is that some of the early suffragists considered themselves, they compared their situation to slavery, like as wives and mothers, that they were enslaved. And that's a bit of a stretch. I'm sure all of us agree as far as their situation compared to people who really were in bondage. So but the thing is that they started to break into two different groups. Around 1869, there was the National Women's Suffrage Association, which was started by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. And they decided to go after suffrage from it having the Constitution amended. So it will be a national approach. And then the American Women's Suffrage Association was Lucy Stone, Henry Blackwell, who was her husband, and Julia Ward Howe. And they decided to have a state-by-state approach because a lot of what was happening when it came to suffrage was that states individually were making it possible for women to have the right to vote. In today's world, it's equivalent to how we have gone state by state with same-sex marriage. But so they broke into these two groups because they couldn't agree. They had a different reaction to the different situation when it came to the amendments that were passed shortly after the Civil War. So those amendments were the 13th Amendment, which was passed in 1865, which was about making slavery illegal. And then the 14th Amendment, which was passed in 1868, which was about citizenship. And then the 15th Amendment is what really made the suffrage movement fracture, well, because they couldn't agree on, they were upset that Black men got the right to vote before white women. Because the 15th Amendment did not include, you see it says race, color, or previous condition of servitude, but it doesn't say anything about gender. So this was a problem for several of these suffragists. And so, oh my God, it's going the opposite direction. So what happened was that in the, so they separated for almost 30 years. And then they, 20 years, and then they merged back into forming the National American Women Suffrage Association, which primarily excluded Black women because of this whole issue when it came to Southern, they felt that they needed to have Southern white women as allies, because most of these women were located in the Northeast. And then in 1913, they broke off again with the Congressional Union, which was considered a more militant branch of the National American Women Suffrage Association. And that was led by Alice Paul, who famously organized the suffrage parade in Washington, D.C. And then when they started all of these protests where they were marching in front of the White House during Woodrow Wilson's presidency, and some of them were imprisoned and they were force-fed, and it was really a horrible situation where these women were basically tortured because they were protesting to have women have the right to vote. That whole situation was run or sort of organized by Alice Paul. So this is the white women's story when it comes to suffrage. Black women had a sort of different trajectory. Instead of, there were some abolitionists, but mostly what happened with Black women was that their efforts grew out of the fight for leadership within the African Methodist Episcopal Church. So there was an effort to gain leadership within the ranks of the church. And as they were pushing for more rights to become leaders in the church, then they decided to start pushing for more rights outside of the church and more into secular world. So it was a slightly different path that Black women had. And there was a whole club movement that was happening in the late 1800s with all women. And Black women, again, had separate organizations. And so 1892, there was the Colored Women's League that was founded in Washington, D.C. With the first president was Helen Cook. And then in 1895, there was a National Federation of Afro-American Women that was founded in Boston. By Margaret Murray Washington as the president. And then there was something that happened in 1896. It's kind of a long story, but there was a newspaper article that was written that was extremely disparaging to Black women overall. And so on a national level, Black women decided that they needed to band together and have a national organization versus all of these different clubs around the country that were operating separately. And so they merged into the National Association of Colored Women. That was the original name of the organization, and now it's called the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. And all of these organizations were focusing part of their agenda was focused on the right to vote. The thing that's different between the Black women's organizations and the white women's organizations is that for the most part, the Black women's clubs were focused on fighting for the right to vote as one of the things that they were focused on. They were also focused on pay equity and having equal housing and equal education and myriad other issues that they were focused on. And so that is part of the reason why today in 2021, the chronicling the experiences of Black women in the suffrage movement is a little more challenging, but was necessary to document because it was interwoven with all of these other issues that, that they were fighting for at the same time. And in 1913, my great-grandmother, Ida B. Wells, founded the Alpha Suffrage Club, which was the first all-Black suffrage club in the state of Illinois. And so a lot of you probably do know who she was, but just showing a picture of my great-grandmother, Ida B. Wells Barnett. She was an educator, a journalist, anti-lynching crusader, newspaper co-editor and owner. She was a civil rights activist, a co-founder of the NAACP and the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. She was also involved in the suffrage movement. As I mentioned, she founded the Alpha Suffrage Club. She was a community organizer. I mean, just on and on. This is all of the things she did, in addition to being a mother of 4 children and a wife. And just so you know how I'm related to her, this is her. She had 4 children. Her youngest daughter and youngest child was Elfrida Barnett. Elfrida Barnett married a man named Benjamin Duster. And so her last name changed it to Elfrida Duster. And then my grandmother had 5 children, and her middle child was Donald Duster, who is my father, and I have 2 brothers. So Ida B. Wells is my great grandmother. She's my grandmother's mother. So this is just a short list of Black suffragists, and I think it's important to have their names because so few people ever learn about the Black women who were involved in the suffrage movement. And this is just a very short list of some of the more well-known names that were of people who were involved in the suffrage movement. Here's my great-grandmother, Ida B. Wells. Mary Church Terrell, you might have heard of. She was originally from Memphis, and actually she and my great-grandmother not only founded the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs together, but they also were co-founders of the NAACP. So they worked together quite a bit. Same thing with Margaret Washington, as you can see, was involved in a couple of different organizations. Mary Ann Shadd Carey is actually almost a predecessor to my great-grandmother. And so was Frances Ellen Williams Watkins Harper. So this is actually a couple of generations. Sojourner Truth was an older generation than my great-grandmother, as well as Harriet Tubman. So I don't know if you want to take a screenshot or something like that of this, but this is just a name, some of the names that hopefully most people in this country will become familiar with, because they are the women that blazed the trail for people like Kamala Harris to not only become, get the right to vote, but to run for office and become VP. And this is pictures of some of these women. I really feel strongly about including images because a lot of times we've never seen their pictures. Their images are sort of left out of a lot of history books, and also to show how beautiful and elegant these women were. So when it came to the suffrage movement, as I mentioned before, women gained the right to vote state by state. And so I'm just going to leave this up for a second, because it's interesting to note that some of the Western states, Wyoming was the first state to give women the right to vote in 1869, shortly after the Civil War. And one of the reasons is because it was very sparsely populated. And I I joke around saying that they were trying to bribe women to come move there, bribe them with the right to vote. And then you have some of the other Western states, Colorado, 1893, giving women the right to vote, in Idaho, 1896. So these Western states were on the cutting edge when it came to for women to gain the right to vote. There was also full suffrage, presidential, primary, and none. So, for instance, Illinois in 1913 gave women the right to vote, but it was what called partial suffrage and limited suffrage, depending on what you read. And so in Illinois, what happened was that women gained the right to vote in presidential elections and local elections, but not for statewide elections. And I don't really understand the rationale for that, for sort of having this like on polar opposite ends. But then you see women gained the right to vote nationally in 1920, and you see almost all of the Eastern states were right around the time that the 19th Amendment happened, 1919, 1919, and we got the right to vote in 1920. So there was a lot going on there. So at the suffrage parade in 1913, which was supposedly a parade for women to march right before the inauguration of Woodrow Wilson, to force him to have the right to gain the right to vote. Now, at this point, women have been fighting for over 60 years. So you hear this story about once upon a time in 1848, there was a convention in Seneca Falls, New York, and that was the official start of the suffrage movement, which is when there was a meeting that was organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. And they created this Declaration of Sentiments, which was almost like they modeled the Declaration of Independence when it came to women's rights. But a lot of times when you hear the story about the suffrage movement, you hear about it as Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. And Lucretia Mott is the left out of the story. But in reality, Susan B. Anthony wasn't even there in Seneca Falls. She and Cady Stanton didn't meet until 1851, 3 years after the Seneca Falls Conference. So what's happening today, and especially because last year in 2020 was the centennial of the 19th Amendment, there's a lot of work going on in academia around sort of correcting misinformation about the suffrage movement and filling in the gaps in the areas that were undertold. And that is one of the myths of the suffrage movement when it comes to Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, how they became sort of considered to be the leaders of the suffrage movement. They were, but Lucretia Mott was there too. So at this 1913 suffrage parade that was organized by Alice Paul, and the solidarity for women to gain the right to vote, they decided to ask the Black women to march in the back of the parade because they claimed that Southern women would feel uncomfortable marching, shoulder to shoulder with Black women. And so they made a decision to make the white women feel comfortable at the expense of Black women. So there's your fissure, and one of many when it comes to women working in solidarity for women's rights. So my great-grandmother was at that parade, and she had traveled with the Illinois delegation, which was predominantly white, but she decided that she was not going to comply with that request, and she famously inserted herself into the Illinois delegation. She walked up the side of the parade as it proceeded, and she jumped out of the crowd into the front and center of the Illinois delegation. And this is the picture of her right here with in between her colleagues from Illinois. So when we come to so I gave like a super brief overview of what happened in the suffrage movement. So now what the problem is when people are learning about the suffrage movement, which basically took place from the early 1800s, about 1820 or so, until 1920, 100 years. People try to say that it started in 1848, but they're forgetting about what happened before 1848. So there's a lot of nuance that goes on into talking about the struggle for women to have the right to vote. And so now we're at a point where we're telling the history of it. And the problem with the way that the story has been told up to this point is it has whitewashed the entire movement. And this is where I'm saying this is a struggle for inclusion, even when it comes to the telling of the history, for the struggle for Black women to be included in the history. So one of the things that has been excluded that now there's an effort to include is the influence of Native American women. The Seneca Nation in particular, when it came to having this Declaration of Sentiments and the influence that these women had on Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and specifically Lucretia Mott, who had spent time with the Seneca Nation. And that is significant because the women, the Native American women in that tribe in around Seneca Falls, New York, were living in a culture that was much more egalitarian than the traditional European, structure of patriarchy. Their culture was women had way more rights, and they were considered equals. In some situations, they were leaders in their tribes. And so Lucretia Mott got ideas from the Seneca women and then proceeded to write them out of the history. And they were written out of the history in this huge, there were 6 volumes that were written by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, where they conveniently forgot a lot of contributions of women of color. And so we today have to go back and sort of fill in the holes or counter some of these false narratives. And then when people talk about the suffrage movement, they make it seem like all women suddenly gained the right to vote in 1920, which is not true. Yes, the amendment was passed in 1920, which legally on paper gave women the right to vote. But in reality, the great majority of women of color had so many barriers put in front of them that they really didn't have the opportunity to vote. And so this is the reality. In 1920, white women gained the right to vote as a result of the 19th Amendment. Native American women, who were here before everybody else, were not able to vote until 1924, and in some situations, as late as 1948, depending on the state they were living in. But they were supposedly given the right to vote as a result of the Indian Citizenship Act in 1924. And then Chinese American women, it wasn't until 1943, so we're talking 23 years after the 19th Amendment, that it took for Chinese American women to gain the right to vote as a result of the Magnuson Act. And then you would fast forward another 32 years after the 19th Amendment, in 1952, when Japanese American women were given the right to vote. See, it's all about citizenship. And so you have this dynamic of people of this decision on who is a citizen and who is not. And so when these different acts were passed, that's when they were considered to be citizens. And so we have to wait another 45 years after the 19th Amendment was passed for African American women to have access, in most cases, to have the right to vote as a result of the Voting Rights Act. So all of the celebration that was going on last year was great and wonderful, and we all appreciate the 19th Amendment, but we have to have asterisks and footnotes on the fact that so many women did not really have the right to vote or the opportunity to vote because of all of these barriers that were put in place. So now when it comes to this huge celebration of the huge achievement of women fighting for the right to vote and gaining the right to vote through the 19th Amendment, then it's like, how do you chronicle this history and how do you celebrate it? So the first thing that was done was the suffrage monument was created by Adelaide Johnson in it was unveiled in 1921. So that was only a year after the 19th Amendment was passed. It only depicted Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Lucretia Mott, 3 white women. And then there was a mound left unfinished, which was supposedly to symbolize, unfinished struggle. The day after it was unveiled, it was put into a crypt in the Capitol, and it stayed there until 1997. So for 50 years, nobody could see it. This is what it looks like. So here, this celebration of white women, there's not one woman of color, depicted or even mentioned. So this is what we're talking about when it's like erasing or rewriting the narrative of what happened. So since 1921, there have been some other statues created and not specifically of them being suffragists, but these were suffragists. So Sojourner Truth, she has 2 statues. Harriet Tubman has several statues around the country. And then recently there was a statue created in Central Park called the Women's Rights Pioneers statue. And I'm going to tell you a little bit of the controversy or the struggle that happened with this Women's Rights Pioneers statue. So the original idea for this statue was to have Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, just the 2 of them. And then there was supposedly a scroll that was going to include 22 other women. And out of those 22, 7 of them would be African American. And I was contacted about this because Ida B. Wells was going to be one of the people listed on the scroll. And a lot of people had a problem with this because they felt like, well, this is a statue to white womanhood, and where are the other people who were involved in the suffrage movement? And there's to have all of the people of color on this scroll. Anyway, it was just really controversial, and there were a lot of people that were writing commentaries in newspapers around this. So then they decided to change the design and get rid of the scroll, and then and they changed the wording a little bit to say women's rights pioneers instead of women's suffragists. And then there was still chatter about that. So what they ultimately created, and it now has been installed last August, was the statue that says women's rights pioneers, and they included Sojourner Truth. And so that's a whole nother discussion on what does that mean when it comes to depicting and chronicling history when you have something like this created, which is not necessarily based on fact. I asked the creators of this if they had any images that they were working from that actually showed these 3 women interacting in real life. Because I'm not sure if that ever happened in this way. So, it's just an interesting kind of debate on how do you create and depict history. So there's another another artist who decided to take a different approach to chronicling or representing this history of African American or women in the suffrage movement. So she came up with another design that has 6 different women. And this is the concept where it's multi-generational. Then it also depicts like the next generation with these children. And then these rings around here would have the names of a lot of different other women. So it's more inclusive. And this is what it was installed in Arkansas in 2019. But then the artist decided that she wants to have this installed in Washington, D.C., like a larger version. And it actually took an act of Congress to make that happen. And she did make it happen. It had to go through the House and then the Senate. And then the President of the United States had to write to sign the law, and the former president actually did. And I think they probably tricked him into, into signing it, but he actually signed it. And so she's going to proceed with this monument that's going to be in Washington, D.C. on federal land. And that's why it takes Congress to make that happen. So the state of Tennessee, I'm going to go pretty quickly now to finish. The state of Tennessee, in my opinion, has done a phenomenal job of telling the story of the suffragists from their state. And they have a suffrage trail that they've created that has all of these components to it, markers, monuments, memorials, plaques, busts, tours, different statues, and then they even have grave sites or that are incorporated into the tours so that people can learn about the suffragists in their state. It's actually ironic to me because Tennessee was the last state to ratify the 19th Amendment, and it was only by one vote. But they're, from what I've seen, they're the first state to create so much tribute to their suffrage leaders. So these are some of the plaques that are along the trail. Here's some of the statues and the busts of their suffragists. Here's some more plaques. And then there's a statue in Knoxville, which was created in 2006. So they're really ahead of time when it comes to their recognizing their suffragists. One thing I want to point out on this one was how much text there is on the base of this. And it's really comprehensive if you even compare it to some of the other statues that you might see in even my presentation. And then I started looking at how many of these statues recognize African-American women. So from this point going forward, the African-American women are in yellow. So in this statue in Nashville, there's 1 out of 5 people depicted is an African-American woman. And this is what it looks like in Nashville, which is the capital of Tennessee. This is in, I forgot the name of the park, Centennial Park. And so these are the women. There's another statue that's being created, or a monument that's being created for Memphis, which was supposed to be installed last year. And then we all know COVID screwed up everything. So it should be installed this year. And you can see that there are several African Americans represented. And I have been involved in writing the text that will go on this monument for Ida B. Wells. This is what it's going to look like. So this is the bust that's being created of her. And then you see there are all these panels, and it's like, it's going to be very substantial, overlooking the river. And then there's another initiative in Northern Virginia that in this area that was on Occoquan Workhouse, which is where the suffragists were imprisoned in 1916 and 17 when they were protesting in front of the White House. They were taken to this workhouse, and so on the land where that was located, there's going to be the suffrage memorial, and this is going to be pretty substantial. These are etchings from their website, and you can see that it's going to be like this park-like area with different stations where people will be able to read information. They also have a website, I put it on here, that has a lot of information about different suffragists. And from everything I've seen around the country, this is the absolute most comprehensive telling of the suffrage movement that includes all women of every race and ethnicity. So these are some of the images. And then just to really quickly let you know what I've been doing, I've edited 2 books of my great-grandmother's writing, and then I just published a book about her whole life. And then in Chicago, I was involved in having a major street named after her, which is, I mean, it's a very substantial street. And it's like amazing tribute to somebody who contributed so much to our country. There's going to be a monument created in Chicago, which I have been working with the committee for the last 13 years to have placed on the land where the Ida B. Wells homes once stood. It's going to be an interpretive sculpture that will have information about her on it. And these were the homes that were named after her, and they stood in Chicago for over 60 years, and it doesn't exist anymore. But I was involved in having a marker placed on the corner where the original sign for the homes were. And this is what the marker looks like. And then I had an honorary street named, I worked with the alderman to have the honorary street named after her. And then the Rose Bowl in 2020 had a suffrage float in honor of the centennial of the 19th Amendment. And there were 5 of us who are descendants of the suffragists who were invited to ride on the float. And there was a huge effort to make sure that there was racial diversity represented on this float, and incorporating the history of all women that were involved in the suffrage movement. And so this is just some of the aerial shots of the float. And then here we are, the descendants of the suffragists. So she's a descendant of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Frederick Douglass, and Harriet Tubman, and then me representing Ida B. Wells. Frederick Douglass was actually at that first meeting in Seneca Falls, New York. He was a suffragist. He was a huge advocate of women's rights. Last year, February 14th, Valentine's Day, was the centennial of the League of Women Voters, which was founded by Carrie Chapman Catt, who also was a suffragist. And so there was a celebration in Chicago, and they recognized Ida. And so you look at the little cake that has her picture on it, and the suffragists from Illinois. I was like, that is amazing. So this is, I mean, I'm trying to hopefully take you on a trip of like how Black women were marginalized and excluded in some situations from the actual suffrage movement. And now today, there's this push to make sure that they are included in this history. And the reason why it's so important for us all to advocate for true history is that still today, only around 3% of history textbooks, I mean, 3% of the information that is in history textbooks focuses on women. We are so underrepresented in the history, and we all need to be involved in changing that. And then when it comes to statues in this country, only 10% of the statues in this country depict real women. There are about 5,500 statues in the country, and about 560 of them are of women. So we have a long way to go. And just to give perspective on that, there are over 700 statues to the Confederacy alone. And so there are more statues to Confederate leaders than there are for women. So we all need to work to get that changed. And then when it comes to national monuments, only 3% of the national monuments in this whole country depict women. And of that, if you break it down by race, then women of color are extremely underrepresented. So I just want to show a couple of projects that are being done to sort of correct this history. There's one in Virginia that I think is amazing. It shows 12 different women, and then look at this wall that they have of all of these different women leaders in the state of Virginia. And this was just unveiled in 2019. Then the city of New York is having an initiative when they realized that only 2 of 5 statues in the whole city of New York represent women. So they're trying to change that, add some more. So there's an initiative to add 7 more women represented. And in Chicago, there's now a new initiative called Chicago Monuments Project, which just started a few months ago, actually, to recognize and evaluate what's going on with the statutory and how representative of it is it. This is what the Shirley Chisholm monument will look like in New York and Brooklyn. And in Rockford, Illinois, just a few months ago, this suffrage monument was unveiled to recognize Illinois suffragists. And so it's very inclusive. And I just took a few pictures. I was at the unveiling. I took a few pictures. You can see that there are all of these women on the base that that show like the leaders of the suffrage movement. And then you have the more current and local people from the Rockford area. And then very recently, there was this huge mosaic in Union Station in Washington, D.C. that obviously shows my great-grandmother's picture, but all of this whole thing is made of thousands of smaller pictures of all the suffragists who were involved in the movement. So to conclude, hopefully you agree with me that representation matters, truth matters, and inclusive history matters. It matters, I think, for men to see women represented in public spaces. And I think it's really important for girls to see themselves in these public spaces. And just to show the power of representation, people today go to Susan B. Anthony's gravesite and my great-grandmother's gravesite to put their "I voted" stickers on the gravesite. And so these spaces have meaning for people. And so hopefully as we continue going forward, we will have more representation and more truthful stories of what actually happened in the suffrage movement. And there will be, you know, just a more complete story that is told about what actually happened during this movement. And I just created this slide of all of the websites in case people are interested in learning way more than I can ever talk about in 30 minutes about all of these different projects. So thank you very much. Hopefully you found this to be informative as much as I could talk about 150 years of history in 30 minutes. And so I guess we'll just go to Q&A.
Wow. Thank you so much, Ms. Dester, for such a powerful and full of integrity this presentation was, and for representing the truth about the suffrage movement and not just an edited version of it. So we do appreciate you for that and for the continuing work that you do. So we have several questions and we'll jump right into them. The first question is, does the National Association of Black Journalists have a scholarship or internship named for Ida B. Wells?
Yes.
Okay.
They have a scholarship, they have an award named after her. I'm not sure about a scholarship, but there is an Ida B. Wells award.
Thank you. The next question is, how can we be more involved in changing the history books to involve more women?
I mean, like here in Illinois, there has been a lot of push for, well, specifically, it's more focused on Black history, you know, to be included in the curriculum in schools. And so there has been so much push that the actual state legislature has passed, I'm not a lawyer, so they've passed, you know, resolutions and whatever you call them, to make it so that that has to be incorporated into the African American history has to be incorporated into the curriculum. And actually, the city of Chicago has made that also. And so I'm sure that we can do the same thing when it comes to women being incorporated into it. So there are two different things. There's textbooks that are written by, you know, different organizations and distributed through, you know, school districts and that kind of thing. And I actually worked for a short time. I worked at one of those major organizations that publishes textbooks. And there are a lot of layers of decision makers that are involved in what information will go in those specific textbooks. That is different than curriculum, because you can have films, you can have field trips, You can have, speakers come in, all kinds of other things that you can do as part of curriculum that is not part of the textbooks. So there are ways, because I teach and Dr. Meeks has taught, there are ways as instructors to incorporate information into your classroom that is not in the textbook.
Yes. Very powerful. And I think that's so key for people to hear, to know that they can make a difference within their sphere of influence. So thank you. The next question, actually, I see about 6 of you said the same thing. So yes, the recording will be sent out in a few days to all of those registered. They want to just reflect on what was shared this week and last week. So you will be receiving that in a few days if you're registered. So the next question is, do you think the League of Women Voters treated Ida B. Wells fairly? Interesting.
Well, the League of Women Voters was not formed until 1920. Yeah, they were not formed until 1920. And so, and she died in 1931. And so that, it was just a short amount of time, but she was kind of doing her own thing in Illinois. And Illinois was a little bit more progressive than some other states because she was involved, she meaning Ida, was involved in several organizations in Chicago that were racially diverse. And so it didn't seem like it was as big of a problem in Illinois as it was in maybe some other states, as far as women working across, racial lines.
Thank you. The next question is, how can we support your efforts, Ms. Dester?
I'm actually involved in, right now, I'm actually involved in having a mural created to celebrate, to pay tribute to Chicago-based suffragists. So if you want to support that, you can give donations to the Ida B. Wells Memorial Foundation. And then I can, and even if it, and if you go on the website, ibwfoundation.org, and then you hit donate, you can put a little note, sure know, like on PayPal or whatever, you can put a little note and say for the mural. So that would be super helpful. We only need to raise $45,000. And my goal is to get 30 people to donate $1,500. So that seems doable, or however many people to donate $500. So if you know organizations that would love to participate in that initiative, that would be great.
Yeah.
Thank you. The next question is, do Indigenous peoples have to give up their sovereign nation citizenship in order to vote?
I'm not familiar with that. I think what happened with Native Americans is just this really interesting dynamic of when the United States government decided to deem Native Americans as citizens of the United States. And so that is a very complicated history because it actually went state by state. Like the state of Arizona did not claim that Native Americans had full citizenship until 1948. Mm-hmm. But then there was the Magnuson Act before that was 1924. So there's all these different dates. And when you think about how absurd is that? That there were all these different dates along our country's history on when people were actually considered to be citizens. And I didn't grow up knowing this information, so as I've been doing more research about all of this dynamic when it came to the suffrage movement, I was floored that Native Americans were not considered citizens of the United States. And citizens meaning having the rights to do certain things. That is what citizenship is having, the rights to do certain things. And so, I mean, even in a broader context, when people talk about like my great grandmother's life and all the work that she did, it's all about citizenship. So, I mean, people, if they want to know more about Native American history, I mean, that's a whole nother, sort of discipline, because it's very unique. Every single group in this country, ethnic group in this country, has a slightly different history that's very specific to their, their experience. And the Native American history is very complex.
Thank you for that. And one of the things that we're very proud of about the Center for Racial Healing is that with our new website at centerforracialhealing.org, we do have a virtual resource library that we are building currently, where we do include the Indigenous peoples, Native Americans, Asian Americans, so forth and so on. And so if you all have any resources that you think are, along the lines of what we're speaking about here, you can certainly send it to us to include, because it's so important for that inclusive history. So thank you, Ms. Dester. The next question.
Dominic, excuse me a second. Someone asked if it's $1,500 donation, and then someone else is having trouble seemingly try to make a donation, and said they couldn't see how to designate it. So I don't want to let that get lost, because we don't want the memorial to miss any money.
Right.
Right. I mean, I'm just saying when you click on the donate button, there's a text box that, when you put your donation in, there's a text box where you can write a note. And so you can write in the note that you want your donation to be designated for that particular cause. There's no separate buttons or anything.
Good.
Thank you. The next question is, where is the mural going to be located?
It is going to be located in a phenomenal area of Chicago, downtown Chicago, in a very highly visible location that gets a lot of traffic. It's going to be really eye-catching. I mean, just striking. So I'm working with a group of women, and we're putting together all of the marketing materials now. So it's not finalized. I mean, the space is finalized, but all of the information, there's going to be a separate website and all of that for this particular project, but it's going to be really, really visible.
Very exciting.
We got the biggest space we could possibly find in the center of the city.
Wow, so exciting. And then I know that our time is short, but there are two, I think, very profound questions here. The first one is, did your great grandmother have any self-care or soul care practices to sustain her?
That's one thing I actually would love to know. Because I mean, her life was so busy and so stressful, and I've always wondered, like, what did she do to relax? Like, what did she do to decompress? And I mean, she doesn't talk about that, in any of her writings, and I can't ask her. And I couldn't ask my grandmother, so those are some things that, people always ask me, if you could ask your grandmother one thing, and like, I would want to ask her, what'd you do to relax? Like, did you have a favorite comedian or what? I know that she really enjoyed theater. And so, she seemed to be an arts patron. So maybe that was some of the things she did to kind of decompress, just go see a play. And she was an avid reader. And she made that clear in her writings that she really enjoyed reading a lot. So maybe that was her escape.
Phenomenal, thank you. And the last question for this evening, and then we'll give it back to Dr. Meeks here, is, Ida B. Wells helped to found the National Association of Colored Women. 10 clubs that she founded came together to form the Chicago and Northern District Association in 1899. Her help for self-care was her friendship with Elizabeth Lindsay Davis, whose writings speak of Ida as her very best friend. More of a comment, but that's good to know. The last question is, has there been a collective impact model discussion among any groups of Black women-led organizations to preserve the history and legacy of women like your great-grandmother and her Black women leader peers?
I don't know. I mean, so there are a lot of people that are doing work around making sure that the story of women's contributions to this country are better told and better amplified. As far as a consortium or some specific organization, I mean, I just know people that I'm working with. There's a group called, well, it's more of a website, Suffrage Race Power, that a friend of mine, Gwen McKinney, started. If you want to Google it. And she's really focused on making sure that the stories of the women who have been huge contributors to this country are more well-known and more amplified. There are so many books that have been written in the last 3 to 5 years. I mean, there's just a lot of, there seems to be this, this awakening and this almost, I don't know, this fervor that's going on of women specifically, and obviously men. There are some men who are like, you know what, we're tired of waiting for somebody else to include us. We're writing our own stuff, we're publishing our own stuff, we're organizing our own things. And I'm sure Dr. Meeks is probably seeing some of this as well as you, Dominique, that there's something in the air now, you know, where people are like, we are going to make sure that this information is told. So I don't know if there's one central, you know, organization. It just seems like it's happening a lot around the country.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And we don't want to stop, but we have to. But I saw Ms. Miller's question last week and this week. So her question is, are there any places or networks or anywhere where we can watch a presentation on your latest book? I mean, obviously purchase it, but is there a place where they can actually watch a presentation on your latest book, Ida Be the Queen?
I think on C-SPAN, well, I think if you go on YouTube, there was a talk that I did for the Commonwealth Club, and I think they put that talk on YouTube. It's on, I mean, they aired it on C-SPAN, and I think C-SPAN, that program is on YouTube.
I believe we can find it from there. Thank you. And so I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Catherine Meeks, the Executive Director for the Center.
We have a couple minutes, and I just want to say how much I appreciate this conversation on the suffragist movement. I think I recall that in the early stages of the Black Power movement in the 60s, there was some serious misunderstanding about African-American women being involved in struggling for gender liberation. It was almost as if you were a Black woman and you spoke up about gender, then you needed to be cast off into utter darkness because you were a traitor to the struggle, you know, because African-American women were supposed to just be about the liberation of African-American people, and somehow the rights of women was just not supposed to be a part of that conversation. So I have just so loved the way you have put this all in perspective for us to see how we were involved and what that looked like, and that it wasn't something that got started in the 60s, that it's
Exactly.
been around, right? It's been around a long time. I
think it's so important for people to recognize that Black women have been involved in the fight for racial and gender equity since before the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
before the Civil War, because there were Black women who were free, and they were fighting for racial and gender equity. And so it's wonderful that people in the 1960s are well known, but we also need to recognize the people in the 1860s and the 1560s and the 1660s. This struggle has been going on for 400 years.
Absolutely. And I especially appreciated, along with this, the commenting about the indigenous women. You know, we have just, what we have done in this country in regards to indigenous women, and we African-American people allow ourselves to fall into that trap too, of sort of marginalizing them or leaving them out or forgetting they were here before we got here. You know, they were here and now we're here, and you can hardly find them. You really have to work hard to find them. So I just thank you so much for bringing to the table that you know, these other people and these issues, and we will continue these discussions, and we'll have you back as many times as you're willing to put up with us. So
I love it. So yeah,
well,
just let me know.
It's just been absolutely marvelous, and I'm so grateful for your careful way of presenting the materials and just the passion and the visuals tonight about the monuments and all of those things. So inspiring, and so helps us to keep on being faithful and standing up to the call to work for liberation for all people who live on this earth. And for the audience, thank you for being present and staying with us and coming back and help to spread the word. Share Ida B Queen, the Queen. Invite your friends to purchase the book. If you are parts of organizations that can have Michelle Duster come and speak, she did not tell me to say this. I'm going to say, I think you can see she would be a valuable resource for your whatever kinds of projects you might be doing. And I would also invite you to go visit the website for the Center for Racial Healing and to contribute there if you are able, and definitely to contribute to the mural for Ida B. Wells in Chicago as well. We are, again, humbled by your participation and presence and support, and we don't take anybody's support for granted. And thank you, Michelle Duster, for being a good representative for yourself. And I know that your great-grandmother and your grandmother and all of the ancestors are incredibly proud of you. And good night, everybody.
Thank you so much. This was great.
Yes, yes.
So have a good evening. Stay safe.
You too. Good night, everyone.
Yes, and get vaccinated.
Get vaccinated.